I just wanted to welcome you all. I have no idea how many people are watching. This is super weird, speaking to an empty room and feeling like you're being watched by countless numbers of people and you don't know who they are. But this is the best we can do, and we're thankful for the opportunity to be able to do a broadcast like this. I hope that this will be a huge blessing to both people that serve in their churches and also church leadership. We've heard a lot of news in the last month and a half or so. We've probably watched countless news broadcasts. We have been on social media trying to encourage each other. We've been going about church through online means. We probably haven't heard enough about the theological and moral implications of the current crisis that our world is in. And I hope that our time together over the next several weeks will help to bring some clarity, some perspective, or at least raise some questions that I think you should probably be thinking about as followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so we're hoping this time will be a huge blessing to you. Again, at very strange times, my wife and I were grabbing a coffee today, and she made the comment, it seriously feels like we're in some sort of a movie. It feels like we're actors in some sci-fi or some futuristic movie. The fact that the world is closed, essentially, and we're all hunkered down, and we are delivering messages through means like this, it's incredibly strange. Even after several weeks of doing this, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it. But we do believe in the sovereignty of God. We are praying that God would teach us whatever lesson He has for us. And the lessons that God wants to teach me might be different than the lessons that God wants to teach you. But as we lean into our Bibles and we engage in thoughtful conversation and we challenge each other's thinking and we prayerfully seek the Lord, I believe the Lord will deliver the messages to us that He wants for us, and we will be a blessed people at the end of all of this. So, if you're just joining us, this course is about answering moral and theological questions pertaining to the current global crisis. Let me just give you a few points to get us started. We're certainly delighted, again, to offer this course at some point in the broadcast tonight. An email, if it isn't already, I think it's going to come up later, it's going to come up on the screen. And if you want to ask me questions, you can submit your questions through email. I have an iPad that's been supplied to me tonight, and when I'm done my teaching, I'm going to open it up, and I'm just going to kind of grab a couple questions, and I'll try to answer a few of them at least. If I don't get an opportunity to answer them tonight, you may receive some sort of a reply from me at a later date. If I don't reply to your email, it's because maybe it was like a super bad question and I have no idea how to answer it. Or it might be because someone else asked the question and I already answered it. So please don't be offended by that, but if you want to submit your questions, you're welcome to do so. And let me just add to that, it might be that you're asking a question that I will attempt to answer on another night. And so I might just hold off on answering those kinds of questions until a little bit later. We're not planning at this point. We are recording this. We're not planning on posting it simply because our editing team at the church here, you can understand, is pretty overwhelmed with Sunday morning production of online services and so forth. So do forgive us for that, but we hope that those of you that are joining us live will be blessed by it. We're planning on going for 4 weeks. Who knows? We might go longer. I tend to be a little long-winded. I got a lot of thoughts rattling around in my head, so we might go a little longer than that, but we're probably going to hit at least the 4-week mark. And for those of you that know me, I don't really need to introduce myself, but if you're joining us from outside of our church, my name is Aaron. My last name's Rock, like a stone, R-O-C-K. And I've had the privilege of pastoring this church, Harvest Bible Church in Windsor, for 19 years come this summer. Prior to that, I was an associate pastor in a couple of churches for a total of about 8 years, and love the local church. I have taught in seminaries and Bible colleges and that kind of thing, but I love the local church. And I do have some expertise in the area of biblical studies and theology and ethics, and so we're hearing from a lot of medical experts, but I don't think we need to be shy about the fact that we do have people around that are thinking scripturally and can provide guidance and direction. I think we've heard a lot of pastoral input in the last few weeks, but in my mind, maybe not enough theological or ethical consideration, so I hope to do that. I'm married. My wife's name is Susie. I mentioned her earlier tonight, and we have 5 children and 1 super awesome daughter-in-law, and we're coming at you again from Windsor, Ontario tonight. So this course came about really just in the last handful of days. Last week, maybe Wednesday or Thursday, I saw a post on Facebook, and I started to type a response, and then my response got really long, so I decided to make it into an article. I have a website blog called Pursuit of Glory, and I posted it there, and then I realized there's such a lot of material in there, it was suggested to me by someone else that maybe I teach a course on it. So we didn't have a lot of time to advertise this, but most people are pretty available right now. Their schedules are clear, so we're glad that you can join us. Well, let's get going. I remember when I was a student in formal institutions, of course, we're always students. When you start a course, there's often this long, drawn-out preamble before you get to the stuff you really want to talk about, and I'm always conscientious of that. I do want to get to some of the questions, like the heart of the issues that we want to talk about soon, but I think it's really important for us to set ourselves up for this. So I have quite a bit of material I want to deliver to you in the form of a preamble. And I'm going to start with just defining my purpose for you. So what is my purpose for teaching this course? Well, let me just tell you this. My purpose is not to offer you medical advice beyond what I'm capable of. Now, I am capable of offering you some medical advice. If you slash open your hand, apply pressure. Okay, I can offer you some very low-level medical advice like that, but I'm not going to get into detailed medical advice in this course. That's not the purpose of this course. We're super thankful for people, even in our own church, who are skilled in the area of medicine. And we will, until further notice, rely upon their input and insight in this regard. We also, however, do need skilled ethicists and theologians to speak truth into our lives without apology, without feeling like second-class people in relationship to medical experts, because I'm going to build a strong argument that the circumstance that we are in is not just a medical matter. It is a theological matter. There are theological implications that we need to consider as followers of Jesus right now. And there are moral or ethical considerations that we need to consider as well. And we're not going to hear that from experts in the fields of medical science, which is fine. We don't expect that. But as believers, we need to consider the theological and moral implications of all of this. I want to therefore offer a framework through moral and theological reflections to believers and church leaders wanting to know a little bit more about what to make of this and how to respond. I want to also acknowledge, I know, and this isn't particularly new in the history of the church, but if you jump on social media and you listen to what other believers say, there's a lot of strong opinions out there, and frankly, some pretty aggressive responses between believers to the things they're posting and mulling through. You shouldn't say that. That's not true. This is true. And some heated arguments have taken place, especially on social media. Well, I just want to let you know I am totally fine with people disagreeing with me. Totally fine with that. It doesn't rock my boat at all. Be kind, be gentle, but I'm okay with pushback. However, I will reserve my right to my opinion. And I would encourage you to reserve your right to your opinion. So one of the things I'm going to be encouraging by way of application as we discuss these issues is robust dialogue. Not just sit down, shut up, let the experts do their thing. No. I think robust dialogue, thoughtful reflection is part of what it means to be a follower of the Lord Jesus Christ. And we need to give one another and the world the opportunity to engage in robust dialogue. Some of the things that people say, admittedly, are stupid, are foolish. But what we need to understand in life, this is just like a proverb or principle, and that is this. If you're going to hear from wise men, you also need to hear from fools. So we need to allow for discussion to take place on both sides of all the different arguments and nuances if we're going to wisely digest and move forward with thoughtful reflection. In this course, some of you might have heard of the three-legged stool of Christianity. So if you picture, I know this stool here has 4 legs on it, but imagine for a moment that it only had 3, and I sit on it and it holds my weight. So this is Christianity. I was taught this decades ago. I don't know where it came from, but there's essentially 3 legs that hold up Christianity. We have our theology, which is the content of our faith. It's our doctrine, the teachings of Scripture, and it's our reflections on doctrine in the form of systematic theology, for example. So one of the things we have to be strong in, if our faith is going to sustain us and hold us up, is theology. Secondly, we have our ethics. Ethics is a word that simply refers to our morals. It refers to our practices. And then we have apologetics, which isn't about apologizing, but it's about giving reasoned answers graciously and gently, according to the Apostle Peter, to those who ask us for a reason for the hope that we have. So we have theology, that's the content of our faith. Ethics, that's the practice of our faith. And apologetics is the defense of our faith. And those 3 things hold up biblical Christianity. For the purposes of this course, there may be some things that are said that relate to apologetics, but primarily I want to talk about theology and ethics. Certain considerations, biblical considerations we must have, and certain practical considerations we must consider. So for those of you that may be newer to biblical studies, when I use the word theological, it might sound kind of ivory tower-ish. It's not my intention. We're simply referring to Bible doctrine, Bible content, and I would just take it a step further, the implications of those things. And then morals and ethics would refer to our practice and actions, and if I use the word spiritual, I'm probably just trying to catch both of those notions. Now for some premises. These are some premises that I wanted to share with you to get us going. So now we're getting into some teaching content here. In the form of questions, I want to ask and give responses to 3 questions. The first is this, because I've heard this from people in not so subtle ways. Is the current circumstance, we'll call it, that we're in as a world, a global conspiracy contrived by humans? What's your perspective on that, Pastor Aaron? I've been asked this question. My perspective is I highly, highly, highly doubt it. I highly doubt it. I highly doubt that this is a global conspiracy contrived by humans. Why? I just don't have a high enough view, I guess you might say, of global humanity to believe that there's a global community that's kind of made all this happen. Don't believe that. Nor do I think that even if there was an intention for that people are coordinated enough to do that in secret. And frankly, I don't have time, even if that were true, for speculation. I have no evidence. So I'm not going to spend my time speculating without airtight, properly sourced evidence. So that's just off the table. This course, in no way, shape, or form, is going to go down the road of conspiracies. I know it might be more titillating and exciting if I did, but I ain't going down that road. Having said that, obviously, I understand that there are people and ideologies with agendas. So there are clusters of people and individuals with ideologies and agendas that may run very contrary to common sense or democracy or biblical Christianity or any of the other things we may hold to be valuable, that will capitalize upon circumstances like this to advance their truth. So we need to be aware of such people and kind of keep our antennas up and make sure we're not being duped by individuals locally or closer to home. But I would just say again, I don't believe this is a global conspiracy. Second question would be, is this a medical issue? And I would just say to that, obviously it is. This is a medical issue. People have died from this virus. That's a fact. However, we need to add to that something else. I strongly believe that this isn't just that. This is also, again, I'll just repeat myself, a set of circumstances that gives rise to some theological considerations and some moral considerations. So is this a spiritual issue then? Absolutely. It's a spiritual issue, brothers and sisters. Is it a medical issue? Yes. Is it a spiritual issue? Oh, yes. It very much is. So again, we need to listen to voices in both of those arenas of life, if you want to call it that. And it doesn't mean that when we get into spiritual discussions, again, that we're all necessarily going to agree, but we're not just going to throw up our hands and smile and stay silent either. I just don't see that as being a responsible response to the circumstances that we're in. Let me give you some illustrations just to kind of get your mind moving. So I think some of the things that I'm going to be teaching in the next several weeks are things that are probably already in the back of your mind. I want to bring them to the front of your mind so that you're hyper-conscious of these things. But here are some examples of moral theological declarations that I've heard. So you might think, oh, it's just medical. No, it ain't just medical. Listen to the moral nature, the theological nature of some of these statements. And in declaring them, I'm not even commenting on whether I agree with them or not. But you've heard these things too. We need to do everything we can to save lives. You think, well, that's medical. That's not a medical declaration. It's not a medical declaration. Animals don't think that way. This is a value judgment. It's a theological declaration, and it's a moral declaration. Churches must not meet and must just listen to the authorities. I'm not even commenting on that at this point. But that's not actually a medical declaration. You're not taught that in medical school. This has a theological, moral undertone to it. Or others that might say, well, we're meeting anyway. That betrays a certain theological and moral perspective about your relationship with authority and government and the nature of the church and these kinds of things. Or when you hear an official say, please call people that are struggling emotionally, that's not a medical statement. That's sociological, it's emotional, it's a statement from a counselor, it's a pastoral statement. That's beyond medicine. The declaration, you need to respect authority. Again, that's not a medical declaration. That's a moral and theological declaration. Or I've even heard, and I'm super thankful for this, certain officials say, our thoughts and prayers are with our health workers. That's not a medical statement. That's moral theological. The declaration that we need to thank God for the COVID heroes, those that are working in essential services, especially in medicine, and putting their lives on the line. That's not a medical declaration. That's something else. Or we need to snitch on rule breakers. Now, all of these statements have reasons for them, good reasons, bad reasons. There's different opinions on them. Not even commenting on that at this point. But these aren't purely medical statements. These have moral and theological foundations to them. So think about it then. If these are, as I would argue, not moral-free, theology-free thoughts, then in order to address these things, in order to consider our response to these things, should I obey, should I disobey? What is the right thing to do? What is the wrong thing to do right now? For church leaders to figure out, how do we lead? These are not medical. These are moral and theological considerations. So we need to start talking about such things. Here are some things that I think Christians are trying to figure out. What is the value of life? Over here. And we're wrestling. Well, what's the value of one life compared to the whole? What's the value of maybe putting the lives of a group of people at risk for the sake of financial livelihood or economic ruin? This is a very real ethical consideration that we have been confronted with in our generation. What does it mean to honor authority? I've had pastors ask me that. What does it mean to honor authority? Like, what are the checks and balances? When do we say enough's enough? Moral question, a theological question. Why are we not meeting when we're actually commanded to meet? Hebrews 10:25, do not forsake the gathering together of believers as some are in the habit of doing. Like, how do we justify not meeting when we're commanded to meet? It's a theological question. How about this very pastoral question? How do I as a pastor, how do we as Christians minister to someone who's dying in a hospital bed right now that we can't even see or meet with? Like, how do you negotiate that as followers of Jesus Christ? I mean, Jesus Christ was always with people in their times of desperation. We're like, we can't go there. We need to wrestle through this. Like, how do we process that and align that up with our biblical theology? How do we celebrate the sacraments, the Lord's Supper, baptism, when we can't meet? How do you do that? And how do we justify not doing it? And then there's a whole series of end times events. And understandably, students of the Bible have different eschatological schemes or timelines, but one thing that all biblical Christians agree with is that Jesus is coming back. And certain things are going to happen leading up to that. So how do the circumstances, the events that we're in, fit into that end times theology? So again, having a moral theological framework to filter those questions through is really important. Now, I mean, I have opinions on all of these issues. And if they're not fully developed, I will develop them. Those of you that are entrusted to my care in our church, obviously I'm going to have greater influence over you and greater opportunities to speak truth into your life. And hopefully we have a high level of continuity and unity in our church. If you're joining us from another church, these are the kinds of things you need to engage in with your church leadership and have conversations about. It's really important. Seeking to understand the moral and theological framework to all of this is really, really important. So how do we do that? Where do we begin? Well, here's what I would like to advise. One of the things we need to spend a little bit of time thinking about is trying to understand the mindset, the moral mindset of the big voices in our lives today. Just being conscious and aware of that. So we have global authorities speaking to us. We have national authorities speaking to us. We have provincial, we have municipal authorities. We have authority figures in our own family clans speaking into our lives. And then we have this weird little group off to the side, the celebrities that are doing all the commercials, speaking into our lives. We get all these voices speaking into our heads. It's like, well, how do I know whether what I'm hearing from them is good advice or bad advice? Well, perhaps ground zero is for us to go back and consider what is the ethical grid, the ethical framework, the mindset of the people that are speaking to us. They don't all fall into one mindset. But you need to think about this. When you hear someone say, do this or don't do that, or this is true and that's not true, you would be well advised to consider, who is this person? What is their worldview, and how, as best as I can, prayerfully and discerningly, how can I determine where that is coming from? Is this like morally neutral, kind of pure, unadulterated advice that anybody and everybody should follow? Or is it possible that the counsel that I'm receiving, the advice that I'm receiving, is actually overlaid with a moral worldview that's at variance with my own? What do you think about that? So what I'm suggesting then, again, is that we think about three considerations to weigh and wade through the messages that we're receiving, again, from global leaders, national leaders, local leaders, and so forth and so on. So little study on Christian ethics. Three areas. The first area to consider is what has been called the scale of moral intensity. So when we are receiving advice or input, it's appropriate to put it on a moral scale. And while right is right and wrong is wrong, there is, without question, a scale of intensity attached to moral issues. So let me just give you kind of like a silly illustration. Let's say on this side of the spectrum, we have a basic question like, should I wear shoes today? Should I wear shoes? And you might think to yourself, that's not a moral issue. Well, it could be a moral issue. Why might it be a moral issue? Well, maybe your mother told you to put on shoes today. And if you answer the question, no, I'm not going to wear shoes, well, now you're guilty of disobeying your mother. Or maybe you're a construction worker. You got to have the steel toes on. Like, I don't need shoes. I got leathery feet. And you go and you put yourself at risk. That's not good body stewardship. Nor is it respectful to your leader. Or maybe on a more silly level, your feet stink. And if you're like, I'm not going to wear shoes today, that could affect your relationships. Your ability to minister to people. They're not going to want to be around you. Right? Like Pastoral Theology 101, pop a breath mint on Sundays. Because you may want to interact with people and dialogue with people after the service, but if your breath ain't good, it's going to reduce your efficacy, your efficiency at ministering to people. So we could argue that while it's not morally intense, it's not like the world's going to end if we get that one wrong. Some of the decisions we make on a daily basis are actually, they're moral decisions. And then on the other end, we could use an extreme example, which I wouldn't even have to argue for, and that is like, you shouldn't murder people. Okay, so that's clearly wrong. Shouldn't murder people. So we could say, a gradation of morals, and when we hear something, we need to ask, is this like an extreme issue, or is this kind of like a minor issue? Oftentimes, I think, I grew up in Canada. I've been here for a long, long time. I don't even need to validate this statistically. I've just been around long enough that I can say this is true, and believe me, it's true. And that is that many times there are things that we are told by government or officials or teachers or educators or professors or so forth, and these things claim to be morally neutral, but they're not morally neutral at all. They're not morally neutral at all. And we need to be careful that we're not being duped. I'm not arguing that there is no such thing as a morally neutral decision. Okay, it's dinner time. Should I have squash Or should I have mashed potatoes? I'm not super hungry. What should I have? Maybe someone could come up with a fancy argument that that's moral. I can't see the morality in that kind of a decision-making process. But in relationships, it's pretty much always moral. When it comes to human interaction, how we relate, how we respond to each other, our responsibilities to each other, which really is the nature of the beast right now, it's really a bunch of relational questions. Can we meet? Can't we meet? Should we meet? Shouldn't we meet? Should I go out? Should I not go out? Should I wear this or not wear that? Should I shake a hand or not shake a hand? These are relational questions, and therefore they have moral implications attached to them. Sometimes we have this notion that, let me just give you some examples of a variety of relational decisions that you or I might make. And we may recognize they're moral, but other times we're not even thinking about it, but they actually are moral. So you're in the parking lot of the mall and it's kind of cold out, weather kind of is terrible, and you want to park as close to the door as possible, but there's not a lot of spots left. So you see the car coming, and there's like that one spot. Maybe a better example of this would be like at Costco. Parking is never great. Like, you try to race them to get into the spot. Now, I'm not saying I do that, because I don't go to Costco. I let my wife go. Not into those big crowds. But cutting someone off or trying to get into a parking spot is kind of a low-level moral issue, because you're making that person walk further. You're putting them in a place of mild discomfort at least. Should I open the door for her? I'm in a hurry. Should I pay my full taxes? Okay, so now we're amping it up a little bit. Should I pay my full taxes? Should I stay home? I mean, hashtag stay home, it's everywhere. Should I stay home and not attend the funeral? That's a consideration that has moral implications. Should I jump in front of a bullet? Okay, so these affect relationships, the way we answer those questions. You tracking with me? These affect relationships. Now you might think, and I remember falsely being taught this when I was younger, that all sin is equal. All sin is equal. It's exactly the same. Whether you murder someone or steal a jelly bean, it's all the same, okay? I get it. All sin is offensive to a holy, holy, holy God. All sin is damnable. I get it. I've read my Bible a few times. But not all sins are equal. Sorry, they're not all equal. Some sins require a much greater expression of human depravity, wickedness, than other sins. We're grieving as a nation right now for what happened in Nova Scotia this week. 20-something people senselessly gunned down by some devilish lunatic. You're not going to tell me that that's the same as someone that steals a cookie out of the cookie jar. It's not the same. That requires a much greater expression of human depravity. And when we look to the scriptures, we see that. So I can give you some references that in the scriptures, not all sins have equal punishment attached to them, which says something about God's view of sin. So back in Leviticus, we know there's lots of like, don't do this, don't do that, and if you do, this is what's going to happen kind of statements. We have in Leviticus 20, verse 2, if you sacrifice your children to Moloch, the foreign god, the people were sacrificing their children to, on fires back then to appease their deity. It's totally disgusting. What's the punishment for that? Death. Death. That says it's pretty serious. Same chapter, chapter 20, verse 20. If you take and marry your brother's wife, you will be childless. Well, that's kind of significant, especially in a covenantal period where one of God's prime blessings was in the form of fertility. But that's not as bad as death. That's a different kind of punishment. Or if you've read the Levitical code, you commit certain sins, you take a grain offering or a bird and you offer it as a sacrifice. That's not the same as death. So there's sins that are obviously greater sins and lesser sins. We're not letting ourselves off the hook. I'm saying, well, I'm just going to commit lesser sins. But there are different weights attached to human sinfulness in terms of punishment and consequences. Now, circling back to a statement I made earlier, we might think that we might inadvertently, I'll say it this way, we might inadvertently believe what I think is a falsehood, and that is that, most of the stuff that takes place in society is morally neutral. So yeah, we're as a Christian community, we're not into whatever it might be. Blasphemy, we're not into sexual perversion, we're not into bank robbery or whatnot. But, most of what politicians do, it's like kind of spiritually neutral territory. Most of what takes place in the teaching labs of our universities is just spiritually neutral. Most of what takes place in our public schools is spiritually neutral. Multiculturalism is spiritually neutral. We're told that, and I have a sneaky suspicion maybe even the vast majority of Bible-believing Christians believe that, but I honestly think it's very wrong. These things are not morally neutral things. Let's take multiculturalism. Now, let's just make sure we're super clear on definitions here. Multicultural is not the same as ethnicity. It's not the same. Ethnicity is your genetics, your family or family of origin, your nation of origin, your ethnic group, your race, whatever you want to call it. It's who you are. And all people in this respect are absolutely equal before God. Ontologically equal, made in the image and likeness of God. There's no place in the church for discrimination because you're white, black, somewhere in the middle. No, we don't go there. We don't discriminate, we don't hate based on ethnicity. But culture is not the same. Culture is basically a series of man-made constructs as to how you operate, how you govern a particular culture, what you value, the things that are near and dear to you. So, again, broadly speaking, there's a lot of nuances to this, but I would doubt that any of you would disagree that Western culture, so let's even just say culture in Canada, one of the earmarks of our culture is materialism and entertainment. The number of hours, let's talk about entertainment, the number of hours spent, these aren't necessarily even innately bad, but the number of hours spent watching sports, playing sports, watching Netflix and so forth is unbelievable. I mean, it's unbelievable. The amount of time we have for vacations and stuff is probably unprecedented in the history of the world. We're materialistic. We have so much. I remember my dad said to me one time, it's interesting. We grew up in a house like this, and we were middle class, and then he bought himself a house like this, and then his kids live in houses like this. It gets bigger and bigger, right? So that the average family house in the 60s is now like, well, that's a little lunchbox. That must be a starter house. What, you only have one vehicle and you only have 8 laptops in the house? You get the point. We have a lot of stuff. And these are largely human constructs that have moral implications. But we're told that multiculturalism is neutral. It's not neutral. Man-made constructs, there may be elements in there that are neutral, but it's not neutral. So culture affects our acceptance or rejection of God, how we worship, how we conduct ourselves, how we spend our time and energy and money, our values, and all that. Tolerance. People think, well, tolerance, why do we emphasize tolerance so much? Because that's the middle road. Tolerance is, at times, the middle road. I mean, in our churches, don't we tolerate breadth of personality and perspective and even theological opinion? It may be a narrow road. It may be really narrow in some churches and wider in others, but there's some tolerance there. But when it comes to tolerance and other issues, we're like, no, we're intolerant. We must be intolerant toward this or that. It might be that God's glory is at stake. So tolerance might sound virtuous, but actually be devilish and we need to discern between the two. Public schools say, well, we're morally neutral because we're public. Well, clearly not. You have a radical sexual education agenda, a radical understatement, sexual education agenda. You have a one-sided view of human origins. You won't even consider the other side. That's not morally neutral. That's morally charged. So here we have it, church. Because we live in a world where there is a scale of moral intensity. Couple points of application. It is therefore dangerous for you to blindly trust the claims that most of the decisions made outside the church are non-religious decisions and therefore morally neutral. So without even specific application to our current crisis, we need to get rid of this notion that this is, like when we're at church and we're ministering and preaching and doing our thing, this is sacred and therefore morally charged. But when we go out there and we listen to the global leaders, the national leaders, the provincial leaders, the local leaders, or the celebrity, well, that's just all morally neutral. We should just go with the flow. That's not wise. And I don't think that's reflective of a proper Christian worldview. Because many, as I've illustrated, many of the declarations that we're hearing are not morally neutral. I'm not saying they're bad at this point, but they're not morally neutral. So we need to keep our antennas up. Secondly, there's no hard, sacred, secular divide, but rather, in all likelihood, more of a gradation. Remember my gradation? Should I wear shoes? Should I murder? There's a gradation of morally intense issues and decisions that we're being confronted with. And if they're not intense, we probably don't need to really worry too much about it, but some of them might be kind of intense and growing in intensity. So let me just give you one little illustration. And again, when lost people without a moral compass, without a Holy Spirit make decisions, many times they make the decision based upon what they consider to be facts and common sense and the public good and so forth and so on. But let me just give you one example of this. There's a lot of conversation going on right now about censorship. Can't say this, can't speak out against that, we don't want people getting the wrong information, so forth and so on. Well, just think about this. If the Church of Jesus Christ right now is absolutely limited around the world to communicating their message through online means only, the full gospel and all the implications of it and all the teachings of Scripture, and then we're like, okay, we're going to go with that. And then there's a drift toward, well, actually, you can't say this and say that. Do you see how you start to get pigeonholed? And you start to get pushed into a corner, and then you're like, oh my word, like how did we get here? We thought this was all morally neutral. We thought that this was just a medical thing. And again, I'm not denouncing the medical nature. We just got to keep our antennas up. You can go from medical, some soft advice, now we got rules, now we got snitch lines, now we got enforcement, now we have censorship. This is all within like 5 or 6 weeks. And if our Christian response is, well, it's just morally neutral, trust the experts, is that wise? Again, not advocating, really not even advocating any practical response at this moment. Just wanting to like shape your consciousness so that you become aware of what's going on, conscious of it. So I want to help you think through some of these issues. So we have moral intensity, and we need to consider the people that are making the decisions. How intense are they about morals? Where are they at in that regard? Then we have the matter of what we could call the scale of moral sensitivity. So now I need to ask, how sensitive are the people or persons or bodies that I'm hearing from that are guiding me, governing me, and directing me? There seems to be a lot these days. How sensitive are they to moral issues? Now, you're alive and well. You've been outside, so you know that there's different opinions out there about moral issues in Canada. There's at least 4 different kinds of people. There's the immoralist. So I'm an immoralist, someone might declare, maybe not in those words, but with their actions. What's an immoralist? Well, an immoralist is someone that says, I deny the existence of right and wrong. I just deny it. That's not even a category I consider. There's no such thing as right and wrong. So an immoralist. Then there's an amoralist. An amoralist might sound similar, but they're actually slightly different. I think there's actually more amoralists than there are immoralists. Amoralists will say, oh, there's right and wrong, I just don't care. I just don't care. It's not, in terms of my moral sensitivity, it's like way down here. I just don't care. So you'll meet people that are, I don't know, are committing adultery, and you're like, that's not cool, that's not right. Like, well, I know, but this is the world we live in. So we have immoralists, we have amoralists, then we have moral relativists. Moral relativists would say, well, right and wrong is contingent upon, so I believe in right and wrong, but it's contingent upon culture, it's contingent upon the situation, it's contingent upon the laws. So let's take abortion advocates. One of their go-to arguments is abortion should be allowed because it's legal. Or at least in our country, not illegal. Okay. But is it right? Is it wrong? Doesn't matter, it's not illegal. That's a relativist. You ask the question, what if you go to a country where it is illegal? Are you going to say what they're doing is wrong? No, they're probably going to be inconsistent in that regard. But that's a moral relativist. And then we have moral absolutists, which presumably most of you are. And a moral absolutist would say there's objective rights and wrongs, and I hope I'm right about what I think is right, and I hope I'm not wrong about what I think is wrong. Everybody makes decisions through one of those 4 categories. You're either an immoral person, I don't believe in right and wrong. If you're a politician and you're an immoralist, are you going to make the exact same decisions on all issues that a moral absolutist is? No. Your moral sensitivity is going to leak through into the bills you propose, into the decisions that you make, into how you govern people. It's obvious that's going to happen. Everybody makes decisions, and your moral sensitivity affects the way you process. So this doesn't mean, by the way, sadly, a little reminder of the inconsistency of humanity. This doesn't mean that good people, moral absolutists, necessarily always make the best decisions. Sometimes they make very poor decisions, naive decisions, knee-jerk decisions, rebellious decisions. So we mustn't conclude that, well, I'm a Christian, I'm a moral absolutist. So that means anything that crosses my mind is going to be better than any atheist on any point. It's not necessarily true. Wish it was true, but it's not necessarily true. However, we could say generally, if you are governed by truth and you're a moral absolutist and you're thinking through the issues, and hopefully in the context of community where people are challenging and your spiritual leaders are helping to fine-tune your views, hopefully you're going to make better decisions. I'll give you an example of this. Even non-believers can make good decisions that are beneficial to God's people. And it might be that because behind the scenes God is governing them. So if you skipped on over to the book of Ezra, in Ezra chapter 1, verse 1, it says there that the Lord stirred the heart of Cyrus to let his people go. This is not a man that would be a moral absolutist and be familiar with right and wrong in the way that the New Testament believer would be. I'm not expecting to see Cyrus in heaven, but God used him and his decisions to release his people. But behind the scenes, who's at work? The biblical writer tells us that God is. Did Cyrus know that? Probably not. So we shouldn't think that, well, if our governing official on whatever level is not a moral absolutist, all of their decisions stink. They may be being used by God to protect you, to accomplish God's good purposes in you and in your church. And I can't imagine that that's not happening on some level, because I'm already seeing some blessings and benefits from this. Just call it the lockdown. That's what it's starting to feel like. We could illustrate from medicine. Let's go straight to medicine. My heart gives out, my aorta blows out, whatever, and I need heart surgery. Who am I going to call? The well-meaning Christian brother. The most heart surgery he's ever done is put together, a few pipes underneath the sink. It's the closest he's ever come to replumbing someone. Or the atheist heart surgeon. I'm going to go with the atheist heart surgeon, the one skilled. However, if I had an equally skilled atheist heart surgeon and a God-fearing heart surgeon, I'd want the God-fearing one. You know why? You might think, what difference does it make? It's morally neutral. Maybe, maybe not. So this would be, of course, theoretical, but would perhaps their moral worldviews affect the degree that they would go to, okay, apart from medical policy and their training, the degree that they would go to on a heart level to help me if I was dying on the operating table? Maybe my aftercare, a willingness to go the extra mile, to get up in the middle of the night to help with my aftercare. I would think that if you could somehow study this out, and I don't know how you would, that there might just be a higher level or a greater sensitivity directed toward the infirmed by a moral absolutist than a person that rejects, let's say, the value of human life, the innate worth of human life, the parable of the Good Samaritan, these kinds of things that affect our response beyond just stitching a person up and cutting and replumbing. This is a person made in the image and likeness of God. So one must consider then, when we are given, let's say, medical advice or advice that is purportedly medical or has implications for medicine, are there other elements at play? Are there economic decisions at play? Now, we all know, whether we put words to this or not, that there are many other elements at play right now. There are economic elements at play. This has nothing to do with medicine. There's economic. Who works? And by the way, when you talk about essential workers and non-essential workers, what you need to understand is you're also, in addition to that, talking about who gets paid and who doesn't get paid, right? So you're not just talking about essential work and non-essential work and who the heroes are and who the non-heroes are. You're also talking about this extra layer of economics, who's getting paid and who's not getting paid. Don't you think that if there's a person out there who has a business, knows nobody that's sick, will never meet anybody that's sick, isn't going to get sick, who is at home but has had to shutter their business and go bankrupt for the sake of the common good of humanity, don't you think that person deserves a hero button as well? I think they do. And there's many, many, many people who for the sake of the common good have sacrificed a whole lot to save lives. Maybe not directly, maybe not by putting themselves, right in the face of the disease. But they've sacrificed many years of hard work and good decision making, and some of them will never reopen. There's economic implications. My point is, there's economic implications to all of this. And we need to ask, what is our responsibility to such folks, if any? We have, just to illustrate this further, again, trying to build this case that it's not all medical. We have advice being given, but frankly, many of the people that are giving us advice aren't medical scientists. Mr. Gates seems to have quite a platform right now. He's not a medical scientist. He's not an elected official. Am I supposed to listen to Mr. Gates because somebody, or maybe it's just a presumption because he has some sort of clout or influence or finances? We have, again, I mentioned this earlier, celebrities providing us with medical advice. These aren't medical experts. They're not really experts in anything related to the stuff that we're discussing tonight. We have property rights issues. You can't go to your second home. If you have a second home, you have a cottage, you can't go there, but you got to still pay taxes. You still fully own it. Okay, I get it. I know the reasons why. I know about the small hospitals up north. I get it. I understand all that. I know about the danger traveling. I get it all. But that's actually not a strictly medical thing. That has a, it affects your view of property rights and ownership and freedom of travel. Lest you doubt that there's no moral implications in all of this, and I was delighted to hear this, but our own premier, I heard it on a couple of occasions, said, "God bless the people of Ontario." That's not a medical statement. That is a recognition of a transcendent being. And I think that's great, but that's more than medical. National consideration. So think about this. We're going to talk about this later in the course. Nationalism versus globalism. And remember when there's the N95 masks, there's like a shortage. I haven't heard a lot about shortages in the last week or two, but there's a shortage, and there's the factory in the States producing them. We ordered them, and the order was vetoed by the US president, all that. Some people are like, way to go. Protect your own people. Other people are like, what in the world? What about the rest of the world? So what you have here is you have two different views of responsibility. Are you a nationalist or a globalist or somewhere in between, or you have no idea what you are? Is my responsibility to the world and the decisions I make? Am I supposed to listen to the director of international organizations or other global leaders? Or am I just subject to national leaders? Or am I just subject to provincial leaders or municipal leaders? Or am I actually before God the leader of my own home, the king of my own castle, so to speak? So we have this issue of national consideration. So there's been declarations. We're closing our borders. Okay, well, right there, you're a nationalist. Why are you keeping those masks from us? Oh, so you're a globalist. Like, what are you? These are not medical considerations, brothers and sisters. Whether you're a nationalist or a globalist has nothing to do with medical science. It has to do with your worldview, and it has to do with your understanding, hint, hint, of where your citizenship lies. So let's just weave into this added element in Christian theology. We're also citizens of heaven. So now I have this third consideration. Where are my allegiances? Where are my priorities? Am I like the global citizen who has a responsibility to save the world and respond to the world's general view of response. Am I a nationalist? Is it all about Canada, Canada, Canada? Then we have fighting between the provinces. And maybe not so much fighting. There's actually been more help than anything else. But there's clearly borders between the provinces, different approaches, some criticisms back and forth. Why didn't this province do this or that province do that? Okay. These are not medical discussions. These are discussions about citizenship. Now, since the majority of Canadians, I would presume, no, I wouldn't presume, I know. Since the majority of Canadians are they either fall into the category of an immoralist, an amoralist, or a moral relativist. I mean, moral absolutists are a minority, folks. We must carefully monitor other people's decisions. So I'm a moral absolutist. I'm not just going to think, oh, well, what you say is what you say. It must be true. No, my Christian antennas go up, and I'm like, where does this person land in the scale of moral sensitivity? Is their decision morally neutral? Or does it actually betray a certain notion of citizenship, which may be contrary to mine, of economics, which may be contrary to Scripture, of who the virtuous hero is, which may or may not be contrary to Scripture? What is the moral backdrop to this person's perspective and worldview? I hope this is helpful in getting you to think through some of these issues. So, I mean, it kind of goes without saying that I am a moral absolutist, and the question then becomes, what if I have to weigh between two challenging choices? So I don't know if you're familiar with this language, and I don't want to use it in a super technical sense because there's different ways this word is used, but I would feel comfortable saying that I don't believe in situational ethics, meaning that I'm not a relativist. I don't think right and wrong are dependent upon the circumstances and situations. But I am comfortable saying I would be what you might call a graded absolutist. So a graded absolutist, basically the perspective is that there's right and wrong, but sometimes if you're confronted with two choices that are arguably wrong, you have to grade them, kind of like weigh them on a scale. And there's been many illustrations of this. I mean, we're not just out killing people, but I guess if you saw someone killing another person or a group of people and you had to kill that person to save the innocent, you would do that. So it's kind of like, I got two bad choices. Do I kill the perpetrator and save lives, or do I just kind of walk away because I don't want to pull the trigger? That would be like a historic classic example of graded absolutes. But how about these? We'll call them absolutes. I mean, they're biblical injunctions. Hebrews 10:25, do not forsake the gathering together of believers as some are in the habit of doing. Now, we're thankful that we can meet online, but folks, meeting online, that's not the church. No, it's not the church. You're listening to me preach, our worship team. There's no relationship. There's not a lot of the one another's going on. There's no celebration of a Lord's Supper. There's no public baptism. It's not the church. I mean, maybe some of you are like, oh, it is the church. Okay, you can hold that view. It's not the church. And I'm not going to settle for that long term. It's not the church. It's what we have, but it's not the church. The Bible instructs us to meet together. I mean, that's just fundamental to biblical Christianity, right? I mean, I don't know if anybody would really disagree with that. It's fundamental. It doesn't matter your denomination. Christians meet together to collectively worship God. So we have that. And then John 15:13, what's the greatest expression of love? Laying down your life for one's friend, for another person. So if I'm like, well, I'm just going to church, Bible says I'm going to church, that's the church. So I'm just going to go around coughing and hacking on people and potentially infecting people. Am I exercising that selfless love for other people that John's speaking of? Arguably, no. But it's like, well, what do I do? Because I feel like I only have two bad choices. I either go to church and don't love people, or I love people and don't go to church. And there's probably some other similar points of tension in all of this. The Bible doesn't say, of course, no greater love has one man for another than he who faithfully attends church. So we have this tension. And I think most, if not all, pastors are wrestling with this, right? And a lot of people in our churches. Like, how long do we set aside Hebrews 10:25? And under what circumstances? And what about public opinion? And what about government edicts and all this kind of thing? And we want to honor the authorities and all these considerations. And 99% of churches, I guess, you could say, and I don't mean this in an inappropriate way, 99% of our churches have chosen, including ours, to disobey the Bible when it comes to Hebrews 10:25. But why do we do that and feel justified to do so for now? Because we're like, well, yeah, but there's probably a greater good at stake here, like saving lives, right? At least that's how it was presented to us 5 or 6 weeks ago. But then questions coming out of that would be, okay, but how long are we prepared to do that? How long? A couple more months? A year? 5 years? 20 years? You're like, don't be ridiculous. Okay, I get it. I probably am being ridiculous. But how long? How long? We're living in this tension. It's like taking an elastic band. You're pulling on both sides, and it's pulling back on itself, and you're trying to hold it apart, but you can feel both sides kind of like at each other. This is a very real example, and again, you could apply your own language to it. I would say that's a graded absolute, and your moral sensitivity is going to pull you in one way or the other. Then we have the scale of moral knowledge. To what degree is the person making decisions for us conscious of moral knowledge? Do they even understand moral knowledge? Do they possess basic moral knowledge or advanced moral knowledge? Knowledge, of course, needs to be cross-referenced with sensitivity. You could know a lot and be insensitive to it. Like the person that grows up in church, they know their Bible, quote unquote, from cover to cover, and they couldn't care less about it. Then you got the person that stumbles into the church, maybe has read like one verse in their whole life in the back of someone's t-shirt, but there's a sensitivity to the things of God. They've been converted. So moral knowledge needs to be cross-referenced with moral sensitivity. And by the way, you don't even need to remember this language. I just want you to get the concepts down. But let's say you could grade people on a level of moral knowledge. You know, in school, I don't know how they do it nowadays. I think it's a little different, but we got A's, B's, C's, and D's. So let's say you were graded A. This means that you were a knowledgeable Christian. You had an advanced understanding of right and wrong. So that's person A. And they get an A. Then the next person gets a B. They have a pretty solid understanding of right and wrong, but they're a newer Christian. There's things they just haven't considered yet. Person C, who gets a C, has a general knowledge of right and wrong. And I would say an example of this would be like my dad's generation. So most people, kind of like 65, 70, 85, kind of in that category, they actually have a general understanding of right and wrong that is very different than the teenagers and young adults of the general populace of Canada. Because they would fall into the D category. Many of them have never been taught a moral precept. Like, as shocking as it may be for those of you that grew up in church, I've ministered to people who have come to faith in Jesus Christ and like, you know what, when I was a lost person, I never realized that going to a strip club was wrong. It never even crossed my mind. I'm like, oh, come on. Seriously? Never thought about it. No one ever told me. In fact, maybe it was encouraged. So we have people in our country have no clue. Not denying the moral consciousness of God and humanity and human responsibility and all that. But their ears have never heard anyone say, hey, dude, that's wrong. Never heard it. So they don't have a moral compass. If they do it, the compass needle just points back at themselves. Now think about this in relationship to governors. Again, global, national, provincial. How would you grade the leaders that are making decisions for us as believers? You might have a few A's, a few B's, a lot of C's, and increasingly a whole lot of D's. You're like, they're going to make morally. It's all medical. They're going to make decisions and we're just going to abide by it. Really? Have I not aptly argued that we're not just hearing medical advice. We're hearing a whole lot of other stuff. Now, hear me clearly. At this point, I am not judging the accuracy or lack of accuracy in most of that. You need to come back next week and the next week and the next week, and we'll start to unpack that. Again, this is all the preamble. This is the preamble. It affects economics, medicine, science. I mean, you think, well, science is morally neutral. Well, science changes its mind. Science, we're told to trust science. Trust. Is that a morally neutral word? No, it's not. At least not most of the time. Again, responsibilities to one another and so forth. So this is all the backdrop. Now what I want to do is spend a little bit of time. I'm just going to, my neck's a little tender here tonight, but sit down for a few minutes. I want to consider some questions. So for the rest of our time, we're basically going to get into questions tonight, next week, the following week. If you've read my Pursuit of Glory article, I've listed set 30. Those came pretty quick, so there's probably going to be more that come to my mind. I'm not going to touch on all of those. I'm going to probably even consolidate some of them, but these are the ones that I think are really important. In no particular order, but these are the ones that are really important. So let's deal with some questions in our time together tonight. Question number 1. What do I need to know about the nature of man when decisions are being made? You do need to know something. This will help you to assess leader decisions, your response, and the response of others. You need to know something about the nature of man. Now, when it comes to the nature of man, we have a Bible, and the Bible has a few things to say about the nature of man. And by man, I mean humanity or people kind, if you like, whatever, floats your boat. What do I need to know about the nature of man? The Bible has something to say about that. Well, when we read our Bible, we're going to reject certain false teachings. Like some things we would reject when it comes to human nature. We reject that humans are merely machines whose value is defined by their work. That's utilitarianism. No, we don't believe that. We reject that we're just animals. Are we categorically mammals? Fine. If you want to call me a mammal, fine. But quantitatively, I am superior. Ontologically, I am superior by far than every other non-human mammal on earth. And that's because I and you are made in the image and likeness of God. That's pretty significant. And by the way, that's increasingly not a view that's held by the general populace. Third, we reject the view that we're just pawns at the mercy of divine forces with no regard for us. Our deity, the true and living God, has great regard for humanity. We're not deists. We're not, God started the world, wound it up and left. We're theists. God created, oversees, sustains, is alive and well on planet Earth. So we reject those things, but we also understand we're not gods either. We are purposeful, conscious creations of the true and living God. made in his image and likeness, and we can only, underline that word, find true fulfillment and satisfaction in full relationship with our Creator God. That's just basic truth. But what we understand is that in the fall, something ontologically happened to us. You know, ontology, like your being, your essence. Something happened to us in the fall recorded in Genesis 3. So in Genesis 3:19, when God's in the garden and he's basically delivering his consequences to Adam and Eve and the serpent, he says in verse 19, from dust you came, to dust you're going to return. You're going to die. That affects your ontology. Prior to that, you're going to be alive forever in the garden. Now you're going to die. And then you're like, well, that's physical death. Flip on over to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. For dead in trespasses and sins. So now we have a problem. We're spiritually dead, not injured, not mildly off base. We're spiritually dead. Body's alive, mind's working, heart's beating, spiritually dead. And some people would disagree with me on this, and I understand that, because on a certain level it's like, oh, I don't really see that. But I would argue that the spiritual death that is now part of fallen humanity actually affects your mind. It affects maybe not the organic, you know, the speed of the mind, the what would be words from computer world? The ability to process data. See, I'm not a computer guy at all. But your ability to comprehend higher truths and to see the big picture is impeded by sin. Now, if you have like a strong sacred-secular divide, you're going to be like, well, no, that just relates to your knowledge of God, just God. But God and his truth is woven into every discipline, every aspect of human existence. So, when you get into the scripture, God has obviously revealed himself to us. A lot of people go around, why doesn't God tell us more? Why doesn't God reveal more? God, it's like God's at fault for not giving us more information. Read the Bible, man. It's pretty big. The problem is not with revelation. It's not in a lack of revelation. The problem is with reasoning. And your mind is darkened to spiritual truths when you're in sin, you're unregenerate. Some have called this the noetic effects of sin. It doesn't teach then that the mind is destroyed by sin, but it's subject to futility and ignorance and a rejection of certain foundational truths. Now, this doesn't just mean the strictest religious principles are rejected, but the way you process all of life is different. When you have a biblical worldview and you've been regenerated by the Spirit of God and born again, or whether you reject the giver of truth, think of the implications of that. The creator, the sustainer, you reject him. You don't think that's going to affect your decisions, your economic decisions, your medical decisions, your sociological decisions? Of course it will. The Bible says in Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It doesn't say, just wisdom related to biblical truth. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Romans 1:21-22 says, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And check this out. Claiming to be wise. Oh, we're so smart. We don't need God to be smart. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. In the same chapter in verse 28, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. Oh, so my relationship with God affects my actions and what I do? Yeah. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 to 14. Since we have such hope, we are very bold. Not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. But their minds were hardened. For to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Oh, so a person that's reading the black and white verses of the Old Covenant scripture, like I can read, can you read? Okay, let's bring my unbelieving buddy up. You read, and I'll read. They're going to read that differently? No. Yeah. I mean, they're going to see the word thus, and everyone, and horsemen, but they're going to see a different message there and take something different away, or maybe just a lack of anything, than the believer whose mind has been illuminated to truth. Now again, some would argue, oh, that just has implications for spiritual matters. I'm an integrationist. Every discipline, we've created this interesting structure in our world. We go, oh, this is math, and this is science, and this is literature, and this is art. They're all separate. This is religion. We teach them like they're all different. No, I'm an integrationist. It's all. You don't think a Christian artist is going to produce art that's different than a non-believer? I used to be an art major in high school, believe it or not. And I spent like all my time, grade 12, OAC art, debating, and because I saw the worldview. The unbelievers, the classical modern unbelievers' view of art is it's about self-expression. So that's why you get grotesque, nonsensical, confusing pieces of art. Because they're confused. Their mind's futile and ignorant. So it's just barf on the canvas, and that's art. And I argue, this is way back grade 12 and 13, back in the, I guess it would be early 90s. A Christian view of art is there's a creator and I'm a creature. I'm not a creator, I'm a creature. But the creature reflects through his or her art the beauty and glory of the creator, or at least the consequences of running from that creator. So there's structure, there's meaning, there's a reflection of the divine other in art. That's a different view. So it's not like art's over here in my Christianity, that's on Sundays. It affects everything. So your belief or lack thereof has implications for the decisions that you make. Unbelievers can see the pieces but not the whole. Here are some things that we should then expect. We should expect from unbelievers moral inconsistency and double standards. You ever see that? Moral inconsistency and double standards, and even in the moment, even in this crisis. We should expect responses rooted in fear and self-protection. Those are not Christian virtues. We should expect responses rooted in sin and half-truths, but not from Christians. We should expect an over-reliance, and I use the word over deliberately, over-reliance on human reasoning and human inquiry to fix things. Sadly, many Christians possess more of that worldview than they do a truly sacred worldview. I think I'm going to be preaching a series coming up. I really haven't started working on it much, to come to think of it, but in the next couple of weeks on basically the difference between a sacred and a secular worldview and apply that to various situations in life. I know where I want to go with this. I think it's really important for us to consider these things. So, in a believer, of course, Romans 12:1, our mind is to be transformed. That's going to transform my view of art. It's going to transform my view of economics. It's going to transform my view of sociology, social work. And it even is going to leak into and affect things like medicine. It's going to. So these are things for us to consider rather than just blindly, I'm going to accept it all. I have two more categories to cover, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to cover one, and then I'll pick up on the other one next week, which relates to what is our responsibility to honoring authority, which is a lot of talk about, and I think some people are misguided in that regard. So we're going to talk about what it actually means to honor authority. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about what does it mean to trust divine sovereignty, because I'm all into the sovereignty of God. I mean, the sovereignty of God is fundamental doctrine. It's core. You can't say you're God and not be sovereign. I mean, our God is loving, but logically, like philosophically, does God have to be loving to be God? No, but he has to be sovereign. You drop sovereignty, you just come up with a different word. It's not God you're talking about. So God is sovereign over all things, and he's loving. I get that. But necessarily, God, to be God, has to be sovereign. So in the Bible, like over 50 times, trust him, O Lord, trust him, O Lord, trust him, O Lord, trust him, O Lord. Mostly in the Old Testament, a little bit in the New. You'll hear people say, because they don't know what else to say, just trust him, O Lord. I'm like, that sounds biblical. That's good advice, trust him, O Lord. But what does this mean for our circumstances? And this is where you get into different practices. What does it mean to trust him, O Lord? Well, here's some options. Do nothing, say nothing, pray and obey. That could be an option for you. Another option might be say something and then pray and obey. Another option might be say something, pray and obey in a qualified way. Another option might be say something, disobey, pray, and do things your own way. So, while we affirm that we're to trust in the Lord, trust in the Lord isn't just, well, I'm just going to sit down and shut up. I'm not going to think through the issues. I'm just going to trust the experts. I guess I'm just trusting in the Lord. No, I think there's some human responsibility in all of this. And don't take my word for it. Look what the scriptures say. So I've just looked up several, not all of the trust in the Lord passages. So Proverbs 3, 1 and 2. I'm not going to read all these, but Proverbs 3, 1 and 2, I'll comment on them. We're not to lean on our own understanding. What does that mean? It means actually in the context to keep God's commandments and not claim innate wisdom and fear God. So this is not trust in the Lord means just be quiet and silent and hunker down and do nothing. Trust in the Lord is the application of it is, what does it mean to trust in the Lord? To obey his commandments. That's trusting in the Lord. 2 Kings 18, 5-7. Hezekiah is, I think I have the right one here. No. Yes, I do. 2 Kings 18, 5-7. In this context, trust in the Lord meant that Hezekiah obeyed God's commandments. So kind of the same thing as the Proverbs passage. 2 Kings 18, okay, this is the next one of that passage. The invaders at the gates, and he's like, hey, Hezekiah says, trust in the Lord. Don't bother. Don't trust in the Lord. He's not going to help you. So what was trusting in the Lord for them? Believing God's promises that he would protect his people if they remained faithful. Psalm 9, 9-10, it meant denying the lie that God had abandoned his people. Psalm 26, 1, it meant trusting God for vindication. Psalm 40, verse 3, it meant worshiping God. Proverbs 29, 25, it's the opposite of fearing man. Jeremiah 17, verses 5-7, what was the application? Don't trust in flesh, don't trust in your own strength. Philippians 2, verse 24, Paul's hopeful that God would give him an opportunity to visit the church again. So, why am I sharing all this with you? To illustrate the fact that trust in the Lord, we need to stop doing this to one another. Trust in the Lord doesn't mean sit down and shut up and just pray. That's not what it means in the Bible. It doesn't say become a political activist either. But this notion of, well, trusting in the Lord means I do nothing. I say nothing. That's not trusting in the Lord. I mean, it may be applicationally in a certain situation. But in biblical context, it's largely about these things. Probably the most core to them is obeying the Bible. So if I'm going to trust the Lord, I need to go to this book and figure out, how do I respond to ethical tensions? How do I respond to authority? How do I respond to the advice that I'm given, to governors, to all these philosophies and movements about how this is going to change our world? Trusting in the Lord is more about obedience to his word and resting in his promises. Trusting in the Lord is not necessarily, it might be, but it's not necessarily silence and doing nothing. 5 points of application then, and then I'll check some questions. Number 1, you are not forbidden to have a viewpoint and still be trusting in the Lord. You can have a viewpoint, said positively. You can have a viewpoint and an opinion and still be trusting in the Lord. You are not forbidden to question. No, you can question and still be trusting in the Lord. Surprise, surprise. Third, you're not forbidden to speak freely. Instead, you can speak freely and still be trusting in the Lord. You are not forbidden to take action. You can take action and still be trusting in the Lord. You do not need to obey those who say, and how many times have we heard this? And I frankly, I think it's a disgusting travesty. And I'm sorry to say it because there's probably some audience members that have done this. You do not need to say to those who preach the word, you just preach the word. You just preach the word and let us take care of this. Stay in your lane, pastor. You just preach the word. And let the officials know. No, I will not do that. I'll preach the word. But trusting in the word doesn't mean I need to be a segregationalist and I'm just going to huddle down on my theology and ethics, because that has nothing to do with economics and sociological implications and justice issues and whether the church can meet or not and freedom of movement. No. I can trust in the Lord and still have a voice in all of these things, unless, of course, in doing so, I violate some other biblical principle. And one of the ones that people question is, what's my responsibility to obeying the government? So we're going to touch down on that next week. All right. So let's see what we got going on here. Okay, I'm just going to pick some of these and see if I can help out a little bit. Okay, so I have a question here. It's quite lengthy, but I have a question from someone who works in the banking industry, and basically they got a call from the Economic Development Canada and Business Development Canada, which are government-backed organizations working to provide interest-free loans and for small to mid-sized businesses. But then there's a discussion, apparently, I didn't know this, about eligibility. And one of the top, this is good to know, I didn't know this till now, one of the top first mentioned criteria is for a business to qualify for assistance, they cannot be considered a hate group or discriminatory toward other groups. Bingo. Bingo. This illustrates the very point that I've been making now for the last hour and a half, in that the world is not spiritually neutral. Now we have banks or governmental agencies determining who qualifies and who doesn't qualify based on your morality. And basically what it's saying is if you're a moral absolutist, you're going into the back burner. So these are the kinds of things we need to be aware of as a Christian community, because, again, it affects how we respond. Now, I mean, I'd have to put some thought, because I'm not a banker, and I don't know the specifics of this, into how I might respond if it was us. First of all, we don't take government money, okay? Obviously, with tax breaks and stuff, you remember a while ago there was this thing about summer student loans, and all these churches freaked out. We dropped that years before, because I don't trust that. I don't want I don't want to ever position our church to be relying upon the unbeliever to fund the purposes of God. As much as we benefit from whatever, tax-free rebates and charitable status, I don't know how long that stuff's going to last anyway. But this illustrates the fact that there are spiritual powers at play. So not a global conspiracy, nope. But I mentioned at the beginning, there are groups and ideologies. It could just be one person at the top of an organization that will capitalize upon this circumstance to, well, punish or at least not bring financial advantages to groups that would stand for many of the same considerations that we have, that we hold dear tonight. All right, second one is if the powers that be decide that nothing can go back to normal, as we know, until there's a vaccine made and distributed to people, and afterwards you must have some sort of mark to show it. Nope, no mark. It's interesting. I'm not an anti-vaxxer, okay? I have respect for people that are. I'm just not an anti-vaxxer. And, please don't, shut the program down now if you are. I respect you. There's differences of opinion on this. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. But one of my concerns is that people will use human logic and human rationale to control the decisions of other people. And regardless of the consequences, I think we need to be we need to yellow light these kinds of decisions, if not red light them. I get it. People are like, well, yeah, but this is going to save the world. This is going to save lives. At what cost? At what cost? What is you're like, well, this makes sense now. What's the next step? What happens next? So sometimes we need to put ourselves in a position of vulnerability and danger, even as a society, to maintain our freedoms, even if tightening the rules may benefit us more in the here and now. Because if we tighten the rules now, that will have a ripple effect on future decisions. So I would oppose that. And I think that would be a dangerous thing for people to engage in. All right. Okay, this is a very pastoral question. It's a question relating to, okay, so we got people not going to church, right? The churches are kind of closed, and church is a place where your faith grows. This person's absolutely right. Okay, I need your spiritual gifts and you need mine in order for us to be the fullness of Christ's body on earth. We're not all teachers, we're not all encouragers, we're not all counselors, we're not all discerners. I'm limited in my giftedness. And together we come and we reflect the beauty of Christ's body, and we need each other. So I'm feeling a little depleted. I'll be honest. I'm feeling a little depleted because right now I'm being a little ripped off from the blessing of the gathered community. And sorry, living in a county with crummy internet, getting cut off every 5 minutes of my Zoom meetings doesn't really cut it for me, okay? And even the phone conversations, it's still limited. So this person's asking the question, what does a new believer do? They're not strong in their faith yet. Maybe they don't have the urge to pray. They're not quite sure how to trust God. They don't have a lot of guidance. This is a great question. I was thinking about this several weeks ago because our church always has new people. The church is almost 19 years old. I don't ever remember not having new people in church on a Sunday, ever. And we have people come in, and some are Christians from other churches, and some are visitors or students or whatever. But we have people come into our church, even the last few weeks, they don't know Jesus. And they're just coming to grips with the gospel. They're not in a small group. They're not connected. And now they don't even know us yet. We don't know them. They've never filled out a card. But they're here, and we're ministering to them. And now there's this lengthy pause. We're not even allowed to meet in small groups. So this is problematic, okay? This is problematic. It's very problematic. And at some point, it has to change. Okay, it has to change. And I'm praying. I'm just praying right now. And I've thought about this a lot this week. I hope very soon, minimally, we can restart our small groups where people are getting together in 5s, 12s, and they can minister to one another because we are concerned about spiritually lost people. In the meanwhile, we trust in the Lord. It's like the guy that comes to Christ in some obscure village in Saudi Arabia. And there's no church, and there's no pastor, and there's not another believer for like 300 kilometers or something. We're trusting that God will do a sovereign work through his Spirit and word to bless that person, that his hand of blessing would be upon them. But it's not ideal because we're designed to be part of a spiritual community. All right. How do we balance the one that wants to get back to church properly with members that are more vulnerable? We're told not to meet. Okay, so, and then there's some discussion here about people who downplay it. So first of all, let people speak. Okay, I think this is really important. Let people speak. Let people, we want to hear from wise people and we want to hear from fools and everybody in between. So someone says something, gracious response, challenge their response, but let's not throw free speech out the door and gang up on everybody else. I think this is dangerous. I'm seeing it even among pastors. And if somebody puts a post out there, everybody's all over them. Look, allow for free speech. Pastor your own church. Lead your own family. Surely you got enough people to deal with there. We can challenge each other. We can speak into each other's lives, but we shouldn't be policing. We're not apostolic bishops telling everyone else how to do things. You're going to do things differently than I am. You're not going to get emails from me, okay, telling you what to do. I'm seeing what people have out there. So it might be difficult, but let people debate. Let people challenge. Let people say wise things and stupid things. Okay, I think that's really important. It's healthy. It's necessary. It kind of separates the wheat from the chaff, too. But the balance, I think, is ultimately going to come. This is just my opinion, okay? The balance is ultimately going to come, and probably what's going to happen is it's going to start to open up, and there'll be smaller groups and larger groups. And frankly, those who are more at risk probably aren't going to be in church for a long time. So we're going to have to continue, as crummy as it is, to minister to people through virtual means who are in those vulnerable categories, right? So not to stereotype, but if you have an 85-year-old person who's immune compromised, and if tomorrow the government's like, green light, open your churches, I'm really not expecting to see them here for maybe several months. So I think what's probably going to happen is you're going to have a slow rebuilding of our gathered communities, our churches, and then hopefully over time, a return to some normal or new normal. People say, well, it's going to be totally different. I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I think it's going to be very similar to the way it was before. That's just my opinion. If things go back to normal, I don't think we're just going to go reinvent the wheel on everything. Maybe if you don't like the way your church operates, maybe this would be a good opportunity for you to reinvent the wheel. I like the way we do things. So people have said, what changes are you going to make when we're all back, if we're all back? Really none? Not really substantively. We're going to do what we've always done because we like what we do. We have a clear discipleship model. We love meeting as a collective community. We worship the Lord passionately and so forth. So we're not going to kind of change our viewpoint just because we hit this road bump along the way. All right. So let me just do one more. So this is a little more lengthy. Okay, I'll just read it. Bonhoeffer's book by Eric Metaxas. Okay, I have read that, but it was probably about 4 or 5 years ago. This is a statement, I think. Then he moved on to clarity that the church does nevertheless play a vital role for the state. What is the role? The church must continually ask the state whether its actions can be justified as a legitimate action of the state. Okay, this is good. I like this. As action which leads to law and order and not lawlessness and disorder. In other words, it is the church's role to help the state be the state. If the church is not creating an atmosphere of law and order, as Scripture says it must, then it is the job of the church to draw the state's attention to this failing. And if, on the other hand, the state is creating an atmosphere of excessive law and order, it is the church's job to draw the state's attention to it, okay? And then there's sort of some other things in here. How should the church be interacting with the state? Okay, this is good. And I think I'm going to share some more details on this later in the course. But I will say right now, this is why we need to say something. This is why we need to say something. Now, if you have nothing to say, just listen, right? When this all happened, I got to be honest, I was kind of confused. I'm like, what in the world is going on? I got a call from a pastor. He's like, they're closing everything down. I'm like, oh, come on, we'll be fine. And then they closed everything down. You remember the Sunday where they limited it to 250? We had like 855 people or something in church. The next week we have 60. The next week we have 0. It's like, how did that happen? So, when this first happened, and I'm still processing this, and part of your gift to me in asking these questions is helping me to think out loud and then by myself about some of these issues. But my baseline response to this is I agree. I think the church should always be questioning the state. I do a little bit of work on social media in the area of free speech, and it's not part of my pastoral ministry, it's otherwise. And sometimes I'll respond to people that just say, like, censorship, we shouldn't allow that to be said. I'm like, no, let it be said. Okay, I wouldn't be the person that I am today if I didn't have people say, Aaron, that was dumb. You shouldn't have said that. Or that was brilliant, that was great. I benefited from that. Ideas are shaped by our collective community in the church in light of the Word of God. And especially in a culture where the church is largely, remember the categories? They're largely in the, I want to be kind, in the immoralist category, okay, largely. It's like everything's right and wrong except for toleration and, we live in a culture where right's called wrong and wrong's called right. I mean, Isaiah had something to say about that. We should be speaking. Now, I would suggest that you reference Peter's teaching, applied to apologetics, but kind of applicational here too. Always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that you have. And then here's the method of delivery. Gentleness and respect, right? So I know that some Christians have a huge problem with certain government officials. And sometimes I'm grieved by the way they address those government officials, because if I was one of those officials, I wouldn't take kindly to being told to off. I wouldn't take kindly to that. I wouldn't take kindly to having my last name turned into a slang word. I wouldn't take kindly to that. That's not Christian charity. Like, you can be as angry as all get out at a decision that a leader makes, but you should be angry at yourself because God ain't impressed if you dehumanize that person by entering into name calling. So we influence. I mean, God help us. It would be great if more Christians were involved in high levels of office. I do know that there's many Christians in our own community that are involved in the medical world and teach at the university. And use your voice. Be winsome, be wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove. Be winsome, speak the truth in love. But one of the core things in all of this is, if you got something to say and it's meaningful, it's biblical, say it, because we are not in a morally neutral time in our country. This is a morally charged environment. And so we're the people of God. And we have truth on our side. We may not be the smartest people, the best looking people, the most skilled people. We have truth on our side, and we want to speak the truth in love.